there's a famous cliche phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. In today's moment, it feels to me that the more things change, the more obvious things become, and by nature of being obvious, are harder to see. Technology and information go so hand in hand with human nature, it's obviously oblivious to us that it's the basis of our whole lives. Our whole culture is wrapped up within those two. The environment around our human community influences the people within it, which then in turn affects what technologies they have to produce and what information they come by in that pursuit. So this inevitably will lead them to pull and be pulled by how they have to interact with humans that are outside of their community. New rivals, rising empires, strange explorers, or allies. All of these can arise at any time. Same with failure events, failures of leadership, or natural disaster. Distilling it all down to 4 parts for brevity, and to construct a shorthand for you listening, these are some of the main pillars to think about when considering any real study of a person or a group of people. The environment of nature and people within and without their community. Technology that the group has and in comparison to their needs. Information exchange and cultivation of new ideas. Before lastly, the culture that's evolving over time alongside all of those 3 factors. Within these 4 are large gradients in the structure of reality as we see it. Because our actual view of reality isn't one of fact, but one where we boil down and finally see our world as a narrative, not the truth of it. It's far easier to remember in story form. Our brains have wired themselves to think in that way, but then if we really break it down, that story is only fragments to hurry along towards a point. In thinking in narrative, we get tied up and commit to memory the message of that story, and we take it as the whole truth of the person or people. And that narrative may or may not even be real. It's easy when seeing other fragments of a story to become reactive emotionally to it, both positively in awe in some unknown aspect of history, or, well, honestly, history is full of repulsive things. I won't even list any. The comments alone could spark some. Those repulsive events, though, were done by beings no different out of the gate than you listening or me speaking. Some gradient of the environment at their time tied with their technology they had up against it, knowledge and how to interpret and leverage it, with a culture to support it. It ended up creating the people and circumstances that those repulsive events occurred, and in some ways were a likely outcome. Except for the chance of our circumstance, we're able to exist here with our norms instead of those of some other time. Whether it's Magellan moving around the world with wind, or Caesar conquering an empire from within. Understanding how to interpret that time with our eyes is useful, I think essential, as an exercise in understanding that can be used for any number of things. From understanding the differences in culture or even ideas, from flat earth and QAnon, to the country of Sweden versus Indonesia. All of us today are far closer to each other than we are to those in our past. Even a QAnon shaman and a Swedish designer. Or as our guest for this episode, Felipe Fernández-Armesto puts it, quote, "No chasm of culture is as big as what divides the past from the present." One of the main figures for this interview is around Felipe's new book on Magellan. The book's titled Straits, Beyond the Myth of Magellan, where during the interview we uncover how in all the collective judgment on the past, we've missed the mark on someone who immortalized themselves fantastically to mask their horrific crimes. Even for his contemporary day, Magellan was quite the criminal. In an episode of Douglas Murray's podcast, called Uncancelled History. Felipe's episode in that series serves as a great juxtaposition between Magellan and Columbus, which he only briefly explains in this episode. However, in that one, he explains the relatively moderate ideas of Columbus compared to his time, and the rather extreme criminality of Magellan. If you want more on that, that is a great supplement to this conversation. However, for this interview, we focus on how to view those in our past, and how they best be judged in opposition to their own time, not ours. In doing so, gross acts still appear gross, but the same with standards against our norms. However trivial and normal they may seem to us now, or grossly inept they may be. Seeing these acts within the context of their time gives us a much deeper understanding of them all. With the influx of information at our present moment, with a culture that will always be too slow to adapt to our change, let alone our current pace of change, understanding fact from fiction can become a full-time job. A possibly helpful idea that comes out of this conversation is to question the source of the information, and if what's presented benefits that source. Comparing that source with another and another and another, over time, a better understanding will start to take shape. Put simply, when looking at a source, motive matters, and it colors one's truth. If it's an example how the knowledge only that person knows or seemingly has to offer, it should cause pause. Earth-shattering knowledge should be easily found and held not just by one character, who it likely benefits. This benefit, though, can get often wrapped into a compelling story that can lull us into a means of taking their story as fact and taking it as an exciting model of reality. This can go for a lot of things, like if the knowledge being presented by an individual or group and what their motives may be, as well as if the knowledge is disseminated back into the culture and move around and understood as fact when it's actually not. Understanding what is true and what is not is a habit of a well-adapted human. Maintaining that in an environment of ease of information is the incredible challenge of our time. Because now we have near automatic means of expressing ourselves. We can post a video and be seen by millions quickly. Should we be able to crack into the algorithmic zeitgeist? But can you really know somebody from that? Can you really connect and understand through that medium? Or what about an exchange on some thread out there? The truth is, much of these technologies can be a cheap substitute for what we had in the past. Connection with other people that we had to be present there for. The Spanish explorers to the Yucatan had to be there in person to get told that their language isn't understood. They couldn't FaceTime with the people on the peninsula. The pace of change and the abstraction away from face-to-face we find ourselves in today can cheapen the respect and attention of the individuals involved in the exchange. And in doing so, respect between the people will go down or at least be altered. This can be an explanation for people getting into rage storms, trolling, or arguing with others, as well as others soaking up the medium to learn a new craft or study, not just falling into this trap that I'm laying out. The culture of mutual respect between people will increase that information exchange, which then can help us conceive of new ideas and technologies to improve us all, which really is the story of human history. Everything we touch is a result of a similar process. Gutenberg needed the Chinese movable print before him, or at least their invention of paper to do so, or farming in the Mideast, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of how looking back tends to cause us to look forward, which after this interview I start to see more and more. We project onto the past what we don't want to see going forward, which is why it can become so captivating to throw hold of an individual out of the teaching of our time for a crime we can't imagine occurring again. let alone looking at it in their time. I want to leave on this point. Having no constraint on one's ability to think through that process, or any other way they wish to think for themselves, should be wholly allowed without external force or power to put on them. Same should go for decisions that one should be allowed to freely make. However, we're humans and we're social, and to perpetuate, that must have some power dynamic at some point. What a moment to be conscious. With that, my interview with Felipe Fernández-Armesto, where we talk about the role food has on our culture, a view on how to better understand the past, the reality of Magellan you've probably never heard, including a case study, and how you die in history reflects on how you persist in it, how to wrestle with false stories, playing with true bits to leverage for someone's gain, how there's a paradox in our time, is how technology gives us a faster ability to connect, but furthers us from understanding one another. Before ending on some ideas from the most distant past to view out on the coming future. This one is chock full of hits. After that, thank you, Felipe, for coming on yet again, and for you who's listening. I hope this finds you well on our big, beautiful planet. Hey, real quick while I have you here. If you like what you're listening to, please tap that follow or subscribe, as well as sign up for notifications so you'll know when our next season or episode drops. Also, if you're curious to look at our catalog of all that we have to offer and some exciting things we have to come, please visit us at bandwidth.productions. Excellent. Cool. Well, thank you, Felipe, again. Need no introduction. Your legacy precedes you, as well as the other 2 episodes we've recorded already.
Well, it's very nice of you to have me back. Sorry to inflict more punishment on the viewers.
People seem to really enjoy your conversations, and well, I know I do. So thank you for letting me steal some of your time.
They're as kind as you are.
Well, I asked you the happiness questions both times, and I was thinking about what I can do to ask you a question that's banal and personal to get started. And I thought about your episode, one of your episodes on In Our Time. And I know I've told you a bunch that I like Melvin Bragg. I'm quite a fan of his show In Our Time, but one of them you were on was about food. So I thought I would ask you what your favorite food is.
Tortilla española. Everybody, food is a very strange thing. We're all, in a way, very open to new gastronomic experiences, and you can see that in the sort of popularity with which most cultures receive and acclaim, sort of food influences from abroad. So, the way Chinese and Indian food, for example, has conquered the West, and the way fusion food has become a kind of big phenomenon nowadays. But as well as being very open to these new influences on a large scale, individually, we're all very conservative about food, and I think everybody likes the food that Mama makes. So in my case, especially as I've spent really my whole life outside Spain, my whole professional life, my own informal education, I always crave the food of Spain. So tortilla de patatas, which is potato omelette, is the thing that, if I've got enough time, I'll make myself.
I like that. I've never had that, but it sounds quite stupendous.
Well, it is it is like sort of Spain on a plate, but you have to soften the potatoes very, very slowly and gradually in olive oil. I add garlic, which is not necessarily universal feature of the recipe, and then you pour on the beaten eggs. So you wait until the potato is really good and soft. You pour on the beaten eggs, and serve it when again, there are different shifts of taste, but ideally you serve it just when the the eggs have coagulated, and um, it's just the perfect combination of textures of the potato and the egg, as well as of flavors. And if it's got, you know, the oil, and if you add the garlic, you need to salt it fairly liberally as well. You know, you can shut your eyes and think that you're in the Sierra de Gredos or somewhere like that.
It's curious how food can do that. I mean, the sense of smell in general can bring memories back sometimes in full color that I feel like is
Yes.
unique to other senses.
Proust's Madeleine, which, you know, was the taste of the Madeleine that unlocked the memories that filled, you know, the 5 or 6 volumes or however many there are of À la recherche du temps perdu.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think it is true that smells and tastes are very evocative of memory for most people. I don't think it's universal, because some of us have our, you know, memories more readily activated by intellectual allusions, you know, and sometimes you know, sights as well can trigger memories. But I think in considering how much less use we make of taste and smell, you know, amongst the creatures of the world, we're actually very bad at tasting and smelling. I mean, my dog thinks I'm really dumb because I don't go around sniffing lampposts. So really, scent and taste play a relatively small part in human lives compared with our visual and aural and tactile senses, but they do have a privilege. I think they do have a privileged role in triggering memory.
Right, which is interesting. Whenever I'm talking to you, I always think about culture a bit more, because I think about culture quite a bit, but I know you do as well. So my mind always goes to, well, also if I'm probably recalling that episode more as we speak, about how much culture is connected with food, and how much it's kind of akin to both. And one of the things that's interesting is the course of time of how agriculture has come into play, and then clashing of other civilizations together, much actually about the age of discovery as well, which I like to talk about with Magellan. I mean, the age of discovery and finding whole continents changed the cuisine quite profoundly. I mean, potatoes, even in what you're talking about, you know, is a new world convention, and how much that has altered cultures into a more, I mean, I don't even know. It's changed it completely. I don't even know how to describe what it's changed it into. A more multicultural, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, you know, you can't imagine Italian cuisine without tomatoes, as you call them in the United States,
Right.
uh, which of course are a new world, in part indigenous new world, that even has a Nahuatl name, because tomato is really tomato. And chocolate, you know, can you imagine European confectionery without chocolate as a new world invention, or Southeast Asian food without chilies and peanuts, both of which come from the Americas. So yeah, it's certainly these ecological transfers that accompanied long-range exploration, colonization, and empire building transformed cuisines unrecognizably and created these new kinds of combinations that we think of as being, you know, viscerally, unmistakably, essentially Italian or Southeast Asian or whatever, whereas, of course, they're really quite recent innovations that were only made possible by what you call the age of exploration.
Yeah, and the infusion of them into these cuisines is almost the memory of that exploration itself, just kind of encapsulated.
Well, it's a bit of a corrective to people who think that empires are only bad. You know, they are bad. They're terrible. But nothing is so bad that it isn't also good, really. You know, there are very few things that humans do that haven't got some sort of admixture because we're all combinations of virtue and vice. And in the case of empires, they did do some good typically. I mean, because they're typically big political entities, and the bigger your political entity, the more potential there is for long-range cultural exchange. And so empires too often stimulate innovations of all sorts, not only gastronomic, but also in the realms of ideas and technology and political institutions, language, music, art, visual arts. I mean, all of these things have benefited from the good effects of what are, generally speaking, bad things, which are empires.
Yeah, no. Empires. I have questions about that too, which is great that you bring that up. They're not zero sum. I mean, nothing is zero sum. But the thing that I always think about when it comes to empire is the safety and stability that they bring, as well as the insulation, safety and stability that empires tend to bring for the people within them, as well as the reactionary ability of the collected resources. So if there's a disaster that happens at one end, it's able to have resources from another end to be able to come in to prop it back up again and so forth.
Yes, if they don't do anything for their subject and victim peoples, then they collapse rapidly. Great example is Spanish Empire did a lot for its subject peoples, and it lasted for 300 years. The Roman Empire did a tremendous amount. Chinese Empire is very long enduring, mainly because it managed to reconfigure so many of its subject peoples as loyal participants in the empire. So all of those historic minorities like the Li and the Pingmin and the Hakans. So nowadays they just think of themselves as Chinese, and I think that shows that they responded with investment in the idea of the empire to the moral and material investments that the empire made in them. Whereas if you get an empire that does nothing for its subject, he's like the Nazi empire. The Nazis founded a spectacular empire in terms of its dimensions, but it was so morally valueless that it couldn't last, and only very marginal groups within the Nazi hegemony benefited from it, and that was mainly only in connection with having an opportunity to make war against their traditional enemies with German alliance. And of course, that kind of thing can only last as long as the war lasts. Right. So the Nazi Empire was doomed by its own failure to serve its subject peoples, whereas there are other empires that have been relatively successful because they've actually conferred some kind of benefits on the people they ruled.
Yeah, most certainly.
In the case of the Roman and Spanish empires, which are two spectacular examples of that, in a way you can see the sort of things that work. If you want to make empire work, if you want to attract the collaboration and even the loyalty of subject groups and their leaderships, the most useful thing you can do is invest in economic infrastructure. The Romans obviously are the great model of this, with all those sort of Roman roads. But the Spanish Empire went much further along those lines. In imitation of the Romans, they built roads and bridges and aqueducts and hospitals on a spectacular scale, and created new economic opportunities for the enrichment of the elites whose loyalty they needed. And although obviously, in all these empires, one of the big problems is a lot of people die. And that's not a great benefit if you're dead. On the other hand, it means that there are more resources for the people who survive. And in the case of the Roman and the Spanish empires, the economic opportunities just increased enormously. And people really did, get rich as a result of being subjects of those of those empires. And let's say infrastructure investment, I would say. I don't know whether you're thinking of this, John, or whether there's anybody, watching the podcast who's thinking of founding an empire. But my advice is, if you do, put a lot of money into infrastructural investment.
I'll certainly keep that in mind if I happen to be looking to found an empire. Rather rejuvenate an existing one, I think is more my end. Which actually, I wrote this down, and I didn't know, I wasn't sure if we would get to it. It's in my extra questions, but we're on the point right now. And you tacitly were almost hinting at it, which is, do all empires in an essence follow similar arcs, and do they have to consider certain things? Really, what I'm curious about is, when the mass of sapiens, of us as creatures, amass to that level, do we tend to have the same features arise? And I mean, you mentioned some that are like, if you invest in economic infrastructure and focus on providing value to the people that are within your empire, that it goes a long way. So that seems like it's a universal. There are other universal arcs that empires tend to go along.
Well, I think successful empires can only exist with the collaboration of a significant proportion of their subject and victim peoples. What you need, under the Nazis, these people were called quislings after the Norwegian leader who threw in his lot with the Nazi conquerors. And every empire has got quislings, and you need, collaborators to be, slightly less, slightly less pejorative choice of word. All empires need collaborators, and I think there's usually a sort of critical threshold. If you get enough such collaborators, then you can keep going. But you need to buy their loyalty, and that's why things like infrastructural investment is critical for the long-term success of the empires that really have experienced spectacular longevity in the past. I think there are other characteristics that empires have in common. In many ways, they're very difficult entities to define, but they're relatively easy entities to profile. And the typical empire profile of typical empires, it's obviously it brings together a lot of different cultures under a single political allegiance. It tends to be a relatively large state, at least compared with the states that precede and succeeded. I mean, some empires are very small. The first state that we typically call an empire would be Sargon's empire, Sargon of Akkad in Mesopotamia, but that was perhaps the size of maybe modern Wales or something like that, but it was still much bigger than any empire and than any state that had preceded it in the region, and any that succeeded it for a long time afterwards. So they don't have to be big, but they have to be big in relation to what precedes and follows them. They typically also have some kind of ideology or some kind of mission, some kind of method of self-legitimation, which involves, wanting to spread some benefit, some idea. Often it's a religion to its subject peoples. So these are the features of a typically imperial profile, and not all empires have all of them, but as is typically the case with the ingredients of profile, you'll find them very widely diffused amongst the states that we conventionally call empires.
That's interesting. I had written this down too, actually, so I'm going to ask it then. Can an empire have virtue or be virtuous? Which what I'm really wanting to ask with that is humans at scale, given time, can they maintain their virtue, or is there a requisite shared culture that needs to perpetuate in order to maintain it?
Well, I think all political life is corrupting the virtue because it's about power, and it's even if you use your power only for beneficent reasons, it's still power. And it still means, that whenever you exert it, you limit the freedom of the guys on the receiving end. So, I mean, I'm a visceral anarchist. I've always thought that what we really want is, a world without power relationships. But of course, that's impossible. Because if we dismantled all the states, we'd still have power relationships among ourselves. I mean, I would still be the subject, an abject subject of my wife, and my PhD students would still do what I tell them, even if they think I'm an idiot, because that's how they're going to get on. So we can't live in a world without power, and the best thing we can do is to make the best use of it we can. And I mean, I think that most states do recognize that it's crazy, to to be evil. It's sort of bad policy to be evil. The Nazis didn't have the sense to realize that, but it's very unusual for political leaderships to embrace evil as a policy. That's something you only find in fiction, really. The evil empire, in that sense, doesn't really exist. So they always set out to conserve their subjects' lives. They don't always succeed. They always set out to perpetuate their subjects' loyalty just for their own sakes. They don't always succeed. And as a result, I mean, the failures and the sufferings that states inflict, the misery, the famines, the wars, these are usually the result of mistakes, not of malevolence. And I don't know, I mean, you can look at what's happening in the Ukraine now, and you can say, I think you'd be perfectly justified in saying that Putin is an evil, or at the very best, a totally amoral character whose sense of right and wrong seems profoundly warped and perverted. But even he isn't, deliberately doing something that he thinks is going to undermine his own success by provoking opposition. He's provoked opposition, but he's done it by accident, by what, well, Talleyrand had a great phrase for what goes wrong in political decision making when he told Napoleon that what he'd done was worse than a crime. It was a mistake. So it's usually not the crimes, but the mistakes of elites that result in the horrors and miseries that we associate with politics gone on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the horrors can be larger the larger the scale. Okay, so
yes, absolutely true. Although a horror on a small scale is still absolutely horrible for the person or persons who experience it.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely. I mean, there's that quote. The death of one is a tragedy, and the death of a million is a statistic. It's individual tragedies are terrible, and it could be consequential, and realities are only what we see through our own eyes. I've been reading way too much Machiavelli lately. Honestly, I've been getting back into reading him, and one of the things that's making me think of what you're saying is that inherently in politics is vice, because it's really about power. Is the role of a state then in such a way to kind of hoodwink everybody to thinking that their existence is that of anything other than power, and to be perpetuating itself by making itself useful or beneficial for the subjects, but constantly trying to hide the power vacuum or power dynamic? Or am I being too Machiavellian?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm suggesting that the exercise of power in states is usually intended as benign, and when you build a great monument, it might be a church. It might be a monument of practical utility. It might be something that is, just purely intended to be beautiful. That is an exercise of power, and you may very well have ulterior motives in doing it. You may be seeking to secure, the patronage of celestial patrons. You may be trying to get God or the saints on your side if you're building a church, or you may wish to erect a monument to some particular cause that is popular with your subjects, or with a section of them that you particularly wish to appease, or you may want to beautify the environment in order to make people feel better, so they're more happy with your own rule. So there may well be ulterior motives. Those don't vitiate the benignity of the effects. I mean, if, for example, I were ever, to write a good book, I wouldn't be doing it only for the pleasure of my readers. I'd also be doing it, for my own self-satisfaction, and perhaps for my own prestige, and even, for my own sales. Dr. Johnson said, "No one but a fool ever wrote except for money." But those motives, if the book was good, it would still be a good book, no matter how self-interested and morally questionable my motives in writing it. And I think the same is true of political behavior.
Yeah, that makes sense. Despite the separation, or at least intentional separation, or attempted, maybe even separation of religion from government, which is such a new idea in the scope of what we know of time. Perhaps we still can't have the religious desires or programming, if you will, taken out of us. It ends up just cropping up again in politics, doesn't it?
Yes, well, I mean, I don't know. I noticed in a recent survey by the U.S. News and World Report, one of those surveys, what countries would people most like to live in. Thing that caught my attention was that of the top 10 countries in this sense in the world, according to the results of the survey, 8 were constitutional monarchies. And I thought that was a rather remarkable fact, considering how people commonly think that monarchies are a rather silly anachronism and isn't actually any good for anything. But it did strike me that one of the monarchies that doesn't feature, it's not a constitutional monarchy, was the Holy See. And that is, of course, the state. I mean, I know that there are states in the Islamic world that purport or try to reintegrate religion and statecraft, but they haven't really succeeded. The Holy See is, the one example of a state in the world today where religious and political institutions are absolutely commensurate. In fact, they're the same. And I was thinking to myself, would that come in my top 10 places where I'd like to live in the world? And I thought to myself, well, in some ways, yes, because it's Rome, and if one wants to go to mass or confession, you never have far to go. On the other hand, I don't know, a lot of people who do live in the Vatican do seem to be terribly unhappy. They're these sort of continual, you continually expose, sort of investigations about, any kind of hint of scandal, immediately triggers a sort of, well, I was going to say inquisition. That's a rather unfortunate word to use in connection with the Pope, but it doesn't seem to be a setup that is conducive to happiness. And so, although I often think to myself, one of the ways around the uh, the failures of politics would be, to put power in the hands of people who are disinterested, who aren't really interested in politics, who are interested in something else, like, for example, religion. And yet, that doesn't really seem to work. Um, um, the people who are interested in running religions are also the sort of people who are interested in running other stuff. And this sort of political ambition seems to be impossible to fill it out of the way we choose our leaders. So so that's a rather long-winded way of saying that I'm afraid I don't think the reintegration of politics and religion would help us in the present world. The American formula separating politics and religion hasn't entirely worked either, and it hasn't led by any means to universal happiness. But I think it's probably the best formula we can have certainly in a multicultural, multi-civilizational world when no two people, even in the same church or community, ever seem to agree about religion anyway.
Yeah, no, most certainly. I think it's an incredible invention that they intentionally did that in such a way. The founders, so to speak. Um,
Yes, well, of course, they already had a religiously plural state
right.
to cope with, and whereas back in Europe, people were still hoping that they could reunify their cultures in a way that was becoming increasingly impossible as religions fragmented ever more.
That's interesting. The pull of that defining. I mean, just I think the way that was put to you earlier in an episode we recorded was the friction between the different politics and cultures and regions of Europe. Definitely is a huge legacy of it. Going back to the kind of age of exploration, if you will, you wrote a book recently on Magellan. And I was wondering if you would just introduce Magellan very briefly, or as long as you would like, and also touch upon what you think the legacy of Magellan is to today, and where we think of the age of exploration as being so far away, but it's relatively recent if we really think of the scope of time. And I'm curious to see what you think the memory of it still is.
Well, I'm slightly reluctant about introducing it because I think he was such a horrible man. But he was, I mean, he's best introduced by way of the myths that people believe about him. People think that he was the designer, if not the executor, of the first circumnavigation of the world. Untrue. He never even contemplated circumnavigating the world. I mean, the idea just didn't occur to him. The voyage that the great voyage that he actually led in his lifetime ended up in a circumnavigation of the world after he was dead, but it was never part of the original plan. He's also credited with having transformed the way science understands the planet, to transform the picture that we have of the world. Absolutely untrue. After his voyage, world maps are pretty much the same as they were before. And Magellan's crucial geographical mistake, which was to underestimate the size of the world. People went on doing that even after his voyage ought to have supplied evidence that this model was wrong. People also think of him as having opened communications across the Atlantic and the Pacific between Europe and the extremities of Southeast Asia. Well, he didn't really do that. I mean, he did reach Southeast Asia, reach the Philippines as far as the Philippines, but by a route that was absolutely unexploitable and which only condemned those who attempted it to near certain death. And I suppose the final thing that people think about him is that he was a great success, that his voyage made money, and that's why it launched a sort of new era in the commercial history of the world. Untrue. the voyage made a loss. The idea that it made a profit is a mistake arising from historians' misreadings of some accounts that date from some years after the voyage. In fact, his voyage was a failure in every respect. Magellan was a failure in every respect. He failed in the commission that he had from the King of Spain, which was to go to the Moluccas. He didn't go there. He didn't even try to go there. When he got to the latitude of the Moluccas, he actually bypassed them because what he wanted to do was to go to the Philippines. He failed in his own objective, because in going to the Philippines, he was hoping, to found a great empire. He didn't. He died in battle against indigenous opponents, and his voyage was a failure by the most basic calculus, which is that 90% of the people on it died. And he lost, all but one of his ships, either to shipwreck or desertion. And 90% death rate is pretty high, even for the early 16th century. So, however you look at him, he was a disaster. And he wasn't even a nice man, because his record of behavior includes, such offenses as treason, murder, judicial murder, massacre, arson. It's not a great record on the side of virtue. And you put all that together, this is a guy who's a total failure and also a really nasty man. And yet, he's the only one amongst all these dead white male explorers whom people still admire. Far more admirable characters like Columbus, who was a good guy. By comparison, people are tearing down his statues and besmirching his reputation. Even in my own university, we've covered up paintings of him because oversensitive people might take offense at them. Yet, by comparison, Columbus was a great success. He did wonderful things for the world, and he was actually really rather, on the whole, had his faults, obviously, but on the whole, he was a good man who wasn't guilty of most of the things that people accuse him of. Yet we've got and all the other dead white male explorers, have suffered similar fates in the face of their contemporary critics and abjurers. Yet Magellan, who really deserves a bad reputation, is still, hailed as this great beacon of modern science, and there are university prizes and programs named after him, universities named after him. There's a whole, sort of galaxy of stars, as well as, lots of species named after him, and he's still very popular with commercial organizations who appropriate his name in order to try and gild their own often rather dubious activities with an aura of science and benefit to humankind. And you've got to ask, why is Magellan the least deserving of these characters, the only one whom people, still positive about? And I find that a fascinating problem. That's really why I read the book.
Yeah, that's fascinating. How quickly did that turn? How quickly did he, in his own contemporary time and then thereafter, go from being an abject failure? Was he seen in his own time as a failure? Was he seen as a success? Like, how quickly did the narrative turn?
During his lifetime, he had, a lot of critics, not least because of the rather traitorous way in which he abandoned Portuguese service and took up service with the King of Spain. But it's really, it's after his death that he undergoes this apotheosis. His death was a great career move. I argue in my book that he deliberately contrived a sort of heroic style death, because by that stage he knew that he'd failed in all his objectives, and he also knew that there was no way out for him, because even if he got back to Spain, he would have been executed as a traitor, because he not only had he betrayed the King of Portugal, he'd also now betrayed the King of Spain by breaking all the king's orders and massacring the king's subjects and putting the king's servants to death. So he knew there was no way out for him when things began to go wrong in the Philippines, and I think he deliberately contrived a sort of pseudo-heroic way out in which, you know, he dies fighting against tremendous odds, surrounded by only a few companions on a beach in the Philippines, which he'd selected in spite of the fact that, you know, in terms of terrain and you know, the tactical disposition of the ground, defeat was almost inevitable. I mean, it's really unthinkable that he could possibly win a battle in the circumstances in which he chose to fight. He really choose. I mean, this was a battle of his own making and his own devising. So, but he dies a heroic death, you know, fighting against the odds. And the second feature of his death, which made it a great career move, is that he had the stooge, if you like, a writer, Antonio de Pigafetta, who accompanied his voyage and who was its sort of official chronicler. He was Magellan's choice of the guy who was going to write it up. And Pigafetta, who was personally devoted to Magellan, who saw him and his master as both as people whom God had kind of selected for some great role in the world. So he writes up Magellan's life in this extraordinarily positive manner. And it makes me think of Winston Churchill. Remember, Winston Churchill said that he wasn't afraid of the judgment of history because he was going to write it himself. And Magellan wasn't up to that. He wasn't intellectually up to writing the history himself, but he had the guy who was. So it's the combination of the heroic end and the absolutely perfect eulogist that projects him into the ranks of heroes.
Wow, fascinating. Well, he sounds like one smart son of a bitch. He sounds like he did a lot wrong, but he seems like he played the game rather intelligently.
Yes, I think that's right. You can do everything right and end up as a failure if you die badly, but you can do everything wrong and end up as a demigod if you die well.
Yeah, it sounds reminds me a lot of Julius Caesar, who was strong enough to at least to write a lot himself, and then maybe knew, or at least get himself immortalized in the way he died as well. You know, are you familiar with Gavin Menzies? He wrote quite a few books.
God, please, I don't know, pass me the sick bucket. I mean, for God's sake.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you if most of his claims are just completely out there, because he speaks a lot of Magellan as well, and kind of cocks him up all as being able to know his route, and is particularly the Strait of Magellan. He claimed, you know.
Right, well, Gavin Menzies, however he pronounces his name, has, as I'm sure you know, a reputation of threatening to sue people who are rude about him.
So, I did not know that. He's since passed.
Let me be absolutely clear. First of all, that what I say is in no way your responsibility, and, you know, Jonathan Bandwidth, you know, cannot be sued for anything that I'm about to say, because you didn't know and didn't deliberately give me an opportunity to tell the truth about Gavin Menzies. Now, the second thing I want to say about him is that he must be one of two things. He must be either a cretin or a charlatan, or both. Because his so-called work is probably the most palpable and obvious drivel that anybody has ever had the immortal right to publish as if it were factual and historical information. And that can only be explained by one of two motives. One is, you know, that he was exploiting the opportunities for vulgar sensationalism in order to achieve a reputation and fortune that he doesn't deserve. or that he's so stupid that he actually believes his own rubbish.
Well, I'm sorry to excite such passions. I had no idea. You know, what's interesting about the internet is that you can read about people and you lose so much of the context about them because the time has such passed where he's seen as still as a kook and kind of a bit crazy. But all of what you said about his threatening of suing or just how sensational has kind of been washed over with time because of the pile of internet rubbish on top of it, you know?
Well, people will believe anything. The internet has shown us, that people will, I don't know, believe the lies of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. By comparison, the lies, the falsehoods, to be absolutely fair to him, of Gavin Menzies are far less harmful. And of course, people believe them in some ways apparently incomparable numbers. But just so that the viewers of this podcast know the sort of thing that we're talking about, if they haven't had the misfortune to read Gavin Menzies' work. Amongst his claims are that Chinese voyages, which we know a great deal about in the 15th century, and which were spectacular and impressive voyages that penetrated deep into and across the Indian Ocean. And we know all about these voyages. He claims that they exceeded the limits that the sources describe and visited, amongst other places, the River Congo, Rhode Island, the Amazon, Australia, Antarctica, and sailed back to China through the Arctic Ocean. I'm sorry. If you believe that, you'll believe anything. It's literally, absolutely, totally impossible. And of course, there's no evidence to support it. The evidence that Menzies' book lists is all, either false or, just wildly misinterpreted. And I mean, he uses a lot of cartographical evidence. He says that Columbus and Captain Cook must have had Chinese maps, to do what they did. And the tragedy of this stuff is that the reality of Chinese history is extremely impressive. In most respects, for most of the recorded past, the Chinese are well ahead of, my benighted ancestors in the West, in science, in technology, in navigation particularly. In empire building, I've already mentioned how successful over an unprecedented length of time Chinese were as imperialists. There's so much in the history of China which needs to be communicated to people in the West so that they can fully appreciate the wonders of the Chinese past, and therefore perhaps, the menace of the Chinese future. You've got to know how great these people were if you're going to evaluate their possible continued resurgence in the future. So the world has got to acknowledge the greatness of China, but it does no service to invent a lot of stupid rubbish, which no rational, critical intellect can possibly accept, because it just subverts the efforts of those of us who are genuinely trying to communicate the truth about Chinese history. So I'm afraid I think, Gavin Menzies is a terrible scamp. And I wouldn't care, but it's also, that he's tried to appropriate the work of respectable historians to try and create a new atmosphere of prejudice in favor of his own outpourings. And that's absolutely wicked and illegitimate to misrepresent other writers as if they agreed with him or supported what he had to say.
Wow, that's rather unfortunate that he would do that. It's very mischievous.
But anyway, why did you mention him?
Because of the Straits of Magellan and his claims with the Straits of Magellan. It's a rather hot internet claim You know what I mean? That the Straits of that Magellan knew about the Straits of Magellan before sailing through them. What I wrote in my notes was, how much is this? Well, I put how much is this bullshit, but the way I was going to ask it to you was, how does this hold any water? Because
well, in 1514, an account was published of a purported voyage, which I think really did take place, in pursuit of a way around or through the New World into what people at the time called the South Sea. That's the Pacific to us. And that publication survives only in a copy in German in the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich. That account of that voyage does describe something which definitely, resembles the Strait of Magellan in very suggestive ways. But that's the evidence. Essentially, that's the evidence. There's also, evidence of a map made by Johann Stromer in 1515, which possibly reflects the information culled by this voyage, or at least reported in this source, which shows something like the Strait of Magellan towards the southern end of the map's representation of the New World. But those two pieces of evidence are probably very closely interdependent. So really, it's only one piece of evidence. But this doesn't connect any former knowledge of a strait or something like a strait towards the southern end of South America with any supposed Chinese voyages or input. All of that's complete fantasy.
Well, okay, so I'm going to go back to the Age of Exploration, but since we're on here by way of I only think of bad adjectives to describe him, but the individual you were talking about is, I'm going to come to this and we can come back to another question I have about exploration. So there's this Friar Gaspar de Caraval that wrote a book, The Voyages of the Amazon. Well, it was really a log of a failed expedition into the Amazon. And the question I want to ask you about it is, how can you interpret what is in texts to understand the truth of it versus how they talk about it in their cultural time or in their cultural motive context and in their motives? Because, for example, this is another thing that is like igniting.
Yes. But I mean, Carvajal's account of his participation in that expedition down the Amazon is one of a number of narratives that survive from that voyage.
Oh, no, I know.
It's very well attested that, we can be quite sure that it happened. There's no doubt about that. The trouble with Gavin Minks's, supposed Chinese voyages is that they just come straight out of his head. There's no
I know.
Anybody can respect in support of.
No, I understand. The point I was making with that was to come to, in our age, you can get hung into truths and they can get blown out into fantasies, right? And if the truth is something that, Menzies took, or in the case of what I'm going to mention now is somebody on the internet, right, could take a truth that's in a text and extrapolate all kinds of imaginations out of it. Like Caraval at some point in the book mentions a group of, well, there's two accounts in there that I find interesting, most interesting. One is where he mentions he meets pale-skinned settlers there. And people in today's time have, said there's a lost race of people that were there for some time and things like that. But my question is, how can you sort out the truth? Because what he could be describing, Caraval, could not be what we are interpreting today, because today we want to find fantasies that make sense to ourselves. So how can one make sense of history, even if they're reading the primary sources and find something that's salacious?
Several of these early sources about the Amazon do describe a world which either never existed or has vanished. A world of really densely populated banks of the river over quite extensive stretches, in which very impressive cities, built largely of wood, but nonetheless on a very impressive scale, existed, and yet within 20 or 30 years, subsequent voyages along the same stretch of the river didn't see anything of the sort. Um, I mean, whether people with pale skin, that's a very subjective matter, and what looks like pale skin to me may not look like pale
Right.
skin to you. You can't put any attach any importance to that kind of very subjective judgment. But I think it is perfectly possible that these early sources were recording something that was really there and that subsequently vanished because civilizations can be extinguished very rapidly by pandemics or other natural disasters or environmental catastrophes. And it seems to me quite likely that the earliest Spanish explorers of the Amazon brought with them those devastating diseases, above all smallpox, to which indigenous populations were unimmunized. And if their buildings, were of wood on the banks of a river, this is, in the tropics, that's a very destructive environment, and the evidence could be obliterated or reduced to insignificant bits of wood in a very rapid period of time. So I wouldn't entirely rule out all of this stuff. On the other hand, no one seeing alterity, especially seeing an unfamiliar world for the first time, unfamiliar people for the first time. No one in those circumstances sees what is really there. This is sort of psychology 101. When we see something new, we try to make sense of it by mapping it onto what is already in our minds. And especially if you're if you're traveling down the Amazon in the 1540s or even in the 1560s, people who were in that situation were themselves in a very unfamiliar environment, having all sorts of new experiences, tortured by elements of the environment, especially climate and disease, that they were completely unfamiliar with. They were usually starving because Spaniards weren't very good at turning the resources of this unfamiliar environment into food, unless natives fed them. They tended, to be run very short of supplies. They also felt defenses, their firearms are useless, their gunpowder was damp, they ran out of shot. All of these circumstances made these journeys very febrile experiences for people. So in addition to the usual psychological obstacles to seeing what's really there, they also have all sorts of other reasons that are provoking them to fantasize. And obviously, all of these early accounts, explorers' accounts, are full of fantasies, very often induced by very unusual, almost sort of psychotropic mental states. And Columbus has visions. Magellan, towards the end of his life, becomes a sort of religious nutcase. It's absolutely sort of standard part of the job of being an explorer in the early modern period, to be subject to the sufferings and to new experiences so traumatizing that they actually change what you see into what you fantasize or imagine. So I think that there is a lot of rubbish in these in these accounts. That doesn't mean that they're all rubbish, or that you can't, with a little critical intelligence, filter out what is or might be true.
I like that. So my thought in this original line of questioning was really about how to understand truth in information, especially because so many things can be extrapolated out of it, and before you know it, you're falling into somebody's argument or point of view without understanding what is actually reality. And I was really looking just if you had any insight and a heuristic of how to understand that. But in listening to you talk, I wonder if it's that we should always remind ourselves that people are the ones who wrote this or have this information or had these accounts, and they have their own motives and they live in their own moment and context of time, and that when relaying this back and parsing it out in our own minds, that we should always remember the context and the humanity of these individuals or stories or accounts, and come back at it with a critical and
Yes,
reflective
yes,
eye.
yes. Of course, you're right, John. And I think perhaps the most important thing that you've said, because it's perhaps the thing that people most need to be reminded of, is that one should bear in mind the humanity of the people one's studying, and that's particularly important if one has a sort of negative view of them, or if one thinks that they were wicked or immoral. You've got to remember that we all are, to some extent. Everybody is a mixture of virtues and vices, and in order to understand something, you've got to try and see the world from his or her perspective and try to understand what he or she thought was going on that did them credit. And that, I think, is the key to understanding one of the most important resources we have for distinguishing what is factual from what is fantastic in the records of the past. If somebody tells a story to his or her advantage, I suspend belief. And I think, well, you can't trust this evidence because there's clearly an agenda at work. But if somebody tells a story which is to his or her discredit or disadvantage, then I think I'm inclined to believe it because the usual motive for lying, which is to make yourself look good, doesn't apply in that sort of case. So I'm always on the lookout. I always tell my students to be on the lookout for the things in the sources which reflect discredit on the writer or on his or her cause. And then you're probably talking about something which is true.
That's interesting. Going back to the age of exploration and the legacy of that, do we still see whimpers of that in today? Do you think is the legacy the legacy of the age of exploration, like Europeans fanning out into the rest of the world and colonizing? And I know that that's a tempestuous point in our time, but I'm looking more of like the idea of the age of exploration. Was that something that the memory we have now of it, was that invented? Is that the legacy? Is the legacy of it an invention? And does that still perpetuate in our time? Or was it seen even then as being this bountiful, cultural exchange and global proportions?
Well, of course, you did ask me about Magellan's legacy, and I thought that I'd kind of already answered that.
Oh, I'm talking more of the
yes, I realize that. But I just want to go back to reassure you that I thought I had answered the question with specific reference to Magellan, because you did ask it, and I didn't turn to it specifically, but that's because I thought I'd kind of dealt with it by saying that he didn't change, people's idea of the size or shape of the world. He didn't open up any new commercial opportunities. He didn't circumnavigate the world or prove that it was round or any of that other rubbish. So Magellan's legacy is pretty much zero. The legacy of early modern European outreach to the rest of the world, of course, is very substantial. And like everything else, a mixture of good and bad. I think the people tend to attribute to it, however, an awful lot of stuff that it didn't do and wasn't responsible for, especially on the negative side. For example, Europeans, Columbus specifically, didn't introduce slavery to the New World. Obviously, we do. You have to go a very long way back. Really, was also into Paleolithic times to find societies for which we don't have evidence of the existence of slavery. It's absolutely normal, standard, and practically universal. Really, we're quite unusual in thinking that it's bad. I think we're right, but I think we're very unusual in thinking that it's bad, and even we still practice it. Depending on exactly how you define slavery, I think we still practice it a lot in connection with prostitution. I think we still practice it a lot in connection with in the United States, with the exploitation of underdocumented immigrants who are in effect, in the position of slaves because they're not free to dispose of their labor, and their employers can do practically what they like with them. And we still practice it a lot in other parts of the world in domestic service. And in the Middle East, a lot of domestic service is still effectively slavery, even where it's, technically against the law. Another, sort of false notion that people associate with the supposed legacy of imperialism is that it was racist. Well, some of it was racist, but not all of it. And in the Spanish monarchy of the early modern period, the amazing thing is the way in which people of different races were able to compete on terms of equality for many of the rewards that were available as a result of the erection of the empire. Another notion that I think is falsely associated with the legacy of empire is genocide. I mean, people have always practiced genocide. It's unfortunately, one of the commonest notions that people have of utopia is of a world free of their enemies. And, trying to exterminate your enemies or your supposed enemies, very common form of behavior, which indeed some communities practiced in the New World before the arrival of European colonists. And again, there were genocidal empires, and I think the early United States was a genocidal empire, which the elite were quite determined to get rid of the native Americans either by expulsion or extermination. Spanish Empire was the exact opposite. Genocide was the last thing on Spaniards' minds and their empire building, last thing on Columbus's mind, because they needed the indigenous population to support the economy. Without indigenous labor, without indigenous produce, the Spaniards wouldn't have been able to survive. In fact, they got rather annoyed with nations when they started dying. Very inconsiderate of them, to die of all these diseases when the Spaniards needed them. So of course, there are many cruelties associated even with the best of empires, but an awful lot of the evil legacy attributed to them either, never happened at all, or happened in selective cases which aren't necessarily representative of the way empires work in general. In the case of the positive legacies, I think the things that people don't give empires credit for, and I stress I'm not trying to whitewash empires, I think empires are essentially evil, because the basic problem with empires is that it involves, one bunch of people being where they've got no right to be in the first place. So I'm absolutely against all empires. And it doesn't mean they don't sometimes do some good. And again, I'd go back to what I mentioned earlier in this conversation between you and me, John. The empires serve as arenas of long-range cultural exchange, the exchange of goods, the exchange of biota, the exchange of ideas, the forms of art. And these are often very beneficial to the people who live in those empires, and they're often very beneficial in the legacy that they transmit to the world. So those early modern empires, really made the modern world possible by multiplying the sources of food available across the world, enabling the planet to sustain a much higher level population, enriching those cuisines that we mentioned, but more importantly, feeding millions and millions of people for whom otherwise there would have been no prospect of life, let alone of survival, if they actually, got to be born. These empires also, communicated benign ways of thinking and living, especially in connection with religion. But there were two things in the Spanish Empire that indigenous people were particularly receptive to and seem on the whole to have welcomed, which the Spaniards brought them. One was the Roman alphabet. I think it's very remarkable how even indigenous civilizations with their own writing systems tended to switch pretty rapidly to the Roman alphabet when it became available to them.
No way.
But obviously, much more importantly, the second thing that they were very receptive to was Christianity. And I think there are very good reasons for that. I mean, if the religion that it's displacing, condone stuff like human sacrifice and cannibalism and war, a religion which at least purports to be peaceful and something, does have a lot to commend it. And then these empires are very creative in other ways. You get new kinds of religion, syncretic religion. You get new kinds of music. You get new languages, Creole languages. Empires are guilty of, eliminating a lot of culture, but they also create a lot of culture. And on the whole, we don't seem to give them the credit for the things that they did well, and we just denounce them for the things that they did badly. I think if we want to respect the truth, we have to do both. We have to denounce them for the things that they did badly, the evil that lived after them. But we have also, to acknowledge that they also played a very positive role in the lives of their own subjects when those subjects survived, and in giving the world, this very rich multicultural world that we inhabit today.
Yeah, I appreciate a lot of what you just said. I mean, I think what you just said about the truth of empires is really the truth of anything, which is to really understand it. You have to understand all sides of all dimensions of it, the good, the ills, the ugly, the beautiful, all therein, because that's the whole. The whole is all the complicated parts.
Yes, I think I fully endorse what you say. I would add, I think it's also very important to remember that if we only sort of sit in judgment on the past, we're doing what we think they did wrong, which is not treating other cultures on their own terms. It's very important to treat every human culture on its own terms and not to judge it from one's own perspective, because then you end up thinking that only what you do is right, only what you think is right, and everybody else is wrong. And our rising generations are in danger of doing that about the cultures of the past. When you judge whether these explorers were doing good, or even you've got to judge it in their own terms, and not judge them by your own standards. Just as if you're white, you shouldn't judge non-white cultures by your own standards, or if you're a European, you shouldn't judge Africans or East Asians by European standards. You should look at the norms of their own cultures and judge them according to how faithfully they respect them. So it's really important, not to be judgmental, but to be open to the possibility that even people whom you hate, dislike, think are evil, or regard as your enemies, actually, may have something positive to praise and even something to teach you about yourself, because without the humility of recognizing that you might not be right about everything, you're never going to improve. You're never going to learn. You're going to start, by removing the beam in your own eye before you start criticizing other people in other cultures and other times.
No, I like that. That's brilliant. Is that is what you just said there. One of the many things that history can help us and tell us about our collective future, that, the importance of meeting others in their own terms and judging them by their own present moment and what it took, the humanity that it took to get them there.
I think we might have talked about this last time you were kind enough to have me as your guest. My view on this is that I don't want history to have any justification. I think if you want to do history, do it, because you like it, and because you feel improved by it, you feel your life is enhanced by knowledge of the past. And for me, being a historian has been a life-enhancing experience, not least because it's been a very humbling experience. Nevertheless, if you do want a justification for being a historian, it is that it does, my phrase for this is, it does make a science of sympathy. It does teach you to suspend your own norms and to try and understand other people according to their own lights. And I think that if you can understand people in the past who were so different from ours, particularly some of those indigenous American cultures that Columbus and Magellan and Cortés and other explorers and conquistadores of the era encountered. Many of these cultures were so strange with their practices of human sacrifice and cannibalism and their extraordinary religions, which are literally, untranslatable into anything that Christian missionaries could even begin to understand. People who inhabited an environment that these Europeans were quite unfamiliar with, and who therefore, sort of ate food and had diseases that they didn't know about. In all these respects, they represented a challenge to the understanding of people who encountered them in the past, and an even greater challenge to our understanding, because there is no chasm of culture as big as that which divides the past from the present. So I think the justification of history is that if you can begin to understand those guys who lived in the past, then you're better equipped to understand people who differ from you in the present. And that's above all, what the world needs is mutual understanding. That's the basis of peace and of dialogue, and therefore, because dialogue leads to progress, it's the basis both of peace and of progress. And we need it if we're going to survive.
Yeah, amen. That was great. That was well put. That's such a great way of perspective that, I do think about this, actually. I never put it into the context of, and the such so plainly as you did, which is studying the past often is remarkable to me how similar people, even as different as living in China, are actually more similar to me than people in the past, and the shared connection that even cultures that can seemingly seem so strange to myself. Like the first time I stepped off of a plane in Asia, I remember the smell being so different. Just the smell of the air was different, let alone the smell of the water. I never knew, the smell of water coming out of a faucet or whatnot. But all of those, aspects are just aspects of modernity that, while are strange to me in the spectrum of what I'm used to, is actually far closer to any depth of understanding that I could have to any of the ancient world. Like I love Rome. I know I'm sure I've expounded this to you enough so this as well. But the thought of walking down the street in Rome, it had to be such a disgusting affair that, I may have fantasized of what it would be like to wear a toga and walk down the streets, but the reality is I'd have to be using stepping stones to go over the sewers that were open, and it's just such a different visceral experience. To understand the past can help us understand our present and find a dialogue to exchange.
Yes, in some ways, I feel that I can understand Pocahontas better than I can understand Putin, or Temujin is easier for me to understand than Trump. It is amazing how in our own world in which so many of our cultural norms are so very widely shared across the planet, how much nonetheless, we disagree with each other to the point of mutual incomprehension and bafflement. And in some ways, I mean, I don't know whether I'm right about this, but in some ways, it seems to me that this is getting worse. And that our ability to understand each other is actually being eroded by the ways we use to communicate with each other. And yeah, I think in the United States today, it's very hard to it's very hard to resist the impression that we have a society so deeply divided that mutual opponents are absolutely incapable of comprehending each other's point of view. And we can see this in issues like, very particularly in issues like, our understanding of democracy, our understanding the role of the Constitution in balancing the elements of government, and above all, in matters of morality, because there's a, a painful, pitiable lack of comprehension between those who want to reform abortion laws to make them more lax, and those who want to reform abortion laws in order to make them more protective of the lives of babies. And the lack of rational dialogue across this divide drives one absolutely nuts, because you just think, surely we can do better than this. Surely we can have civilized dialogues that can lead to a workable society in which we can both respect each other's views and do our utmost to create a society and a set of laws in which those conflicting views are accommodated as much as they possibly can be.
That's the goal. That should be the goal. I think the conundrum of the time, insofar as I see it, and I'm biased because I'm in tech, is how much technology is usurped it. And by then I mean, information or media technology. It's not, if I was to look at this in so far as like a game theory, it's not in the interests of politicians to necessarily even act like they understand each other, because there are much more shared understanding between their constituents and their motives and their wants and their desires than they like to play off, because it's in their interests to have an enemy, to have someone to disagree with, and to have the most energizing issues in which to get their constituents to make sure that they vote for them.
Well, you're right, of course. People, some people are, viscerally conflictive, and they like conflict, and they love to have enemies. But I just feel that a moment's reflection should convince one that in terms of one's own long-term interest, it's far better to have friends, and, it's far better to have peace than it is to have enemies and conflicts. I think a world without tensions and a world without disagreements would be very boring. Indeed, disagreement is essential to progress. Everybody agrees with everybody else, and nothing will ever get done. Nothing will ever be improved. But it seems to me that there's a big difference between civilized, productive, peaceful disagreement and the kind of world that we are increasingly living in, where there is no prospect of dialogue because the level of incomprehension is so profound. And there is a paradox here, because we have greatly improved our technologies of communication, and yet the degree of mutual understanding that they lead to seems to be ever more exiguous. And I give you maybe this is a silly example, but just give you an example from a class that I'm trying to teach every year. I try always to teach new things and to devise new courses. But one course that I teach every year is a course based entirely on indigenous language documents from Native American sources in the colonial period of the Spanish Empire. I think it's a very important course because it's absolutely focused on the indigenous point of view. We don't look at any, Spanish sources. We only look at the way indigenous people saw the world that they were in as subject communities of the Spanish monarchy. And one of the documents that we've been looking at this week is about the Spaniards arriving in Yucatan, in the Maya world in the 16th century. And this indigenous document describes a purported dialogue which took place between the arriving Spaniards and the natives. And of course, they didn't have any common language. And the Spaniards said, "Where are we?" And the natives, in their own language in Yucatec, said, "We don't understand you." And the Spaniards, mishearing the word for "we do not understand you," thought that the place was called Yucatan. And so literally, Yucatan is a misrendering of the Yucatec for "we do not understand." And yet, in spite of that, indigenous and Spanish people got on amazingly well in that area, in the early colonial period, and with a few exceptions, it was a remarkably peaceful period. And it seems to me to be amazing that people can understand each other better in the 16th century against that background where they don't have the technology, for instant translation. And we've got all of that technology, and we've got all these instant global communication systems, and they don't seem to help us to create either mutual understanding or the peaceful and progressive world that might ensue if we could achieve it.
Yeah, and I wonder if the truth in that paradox goes back to something you said the first time we talked, which actually I think about quite a bit, which you said that comfort is the enemy of well-being. And I wonder if the convenience and the quickness that you said of our information exchange now is, well, I mean, it quite flatly is cheapening the experience. I mean, you and I sitting across from each other in this, Zoom chat is much closer than a text message. I can understand way more of the context of our communication than if it wasn't a text message. But yeah, how often are we even connecting and communicating, in this manner versus face to face versus, them, the Spanish standing in their rather overclothed attire for the tropics and the native dress of the individuals next to them. That's exchanging so much more information than just a text bubble, which is mostly what we do now.
Well, what you say is very interesting, John. I mean, I think obviously this is kind of obvious point, just a prefatory obvious point, that the reason why we can communicate isn't because of the technology that enables you to be, scores of miles away whilst I'm, sitting at Notre Dame. It's not the technology that enables our dialogue; it's the fact that we approach it in an open-minded spirit. And you put to me questions in the I hope not in the expectation that I'll produce good and wise answers, at least in the hope. You put your questions to me in a hopeful spirit, and I reply to you with total candor, and I'm willing to say things, nasty things about people who I think are charlatans, and also risky things about people who most people hate. I'm willing to talk to you in great candor because we both know that we're conducting our dialogue in an open-minded spirit of mutual respect. So that's the critical thing. It's not the technology, it's the attitude of mind that's critical in any act of communication. And I strongly suspect that the problem with our very sophisticated technologies of communication is that they give us the illusion that understanding is going to be easy. And maybe that's the sense in which comfort is a negative influence. Once you start getting complacent about anything, you really undermine your opportunities for success, because only when you're really making an effort that you can really make progress. And I guess those Spaniards and Magellan, although they didn't understand each other very well, at least to begin with, were making the effort. They really wanted to understand each other because the Spaniards wanted to see what advantages they could get from establishing relationships with these people. And the Maya were exactly the same. They were thinking to themselves, what use can we make of these strangers? So they didn't have very propitious technologies, but they had the right disposition. They were making a big effort. And I think we just need to make more effort to understand each other and not to be lulled into a false sense of security by the illusion that our very capacious technologies make it easy to understand each other. They don't. Understanding is always very difficult. I once thought of writing a history of misunderstanding. I once gave a course of lectures on the history of misunderstanding of the Complutense University in Madrid. And I think one of the things that I learned as a result of being interested in misunderstanding is that it's much more common than understanding. The easy thing is to misunderstand each other. To understand each other is really relatively hard.
Yeah,
Need to take the effort.
Just like how you've said before, how good ideas are much more difficult and much harder than bad ideas. Bad ideas are much easier. I guess in the same context that you just said. I really enjoy, and I mentioned this last time, I really enjoy your history of ideas lectures from recorded books and just your overall work of calling out ideas. I rather like calling out the obvious because I think there's a lot of virtue and utility in calling out the obvious. So you calling out ideas, I think, is great because ideas are the obvious. They're the things we kind of forget that governments or anything that we've been talking about, empires, those are all just ideas. And we're kind of skirting around it. And I wonder if you have any thoughts other than maybe understanding and effort and empathy and whatnot of what are some of the ideas needed for the next 100 years or the next centuries, not necessarily the ones that are pervasive, because that's kind of the it's hard to escape everyone talking about the pervasive ideas right now. But what are the ones that are needed?
Well, thank you for the question. It's always nice to get an opportunity to plug one's own work. The book that you kindly just recommended is really just, I mean, it's just a collection of very, very, very short essays, each discrete essay on one idea. I have now written a continuous narrative history of ideas, which incorporates a lot of that material one way and another, but which approaches the subject as if it were possible to write a coherent, continuous history of the way ideas have changed. And that work is called Out of Our Minds, because very often the very best ideas seemed, especially when first divulged, to be so mad as to give us the impression that not only do the ideas come out of our minds, but they make us seem out of our minds at the other. And in that book, I start very early with pre-Homo sapiens, hominids, and asking, well, how did those guys think? I go a great deal. I don't think any other historian of ideas has ever done this. I try to go into great detail on the cognitive science of thinking and trying to understand, how we have ideas in the first place. And the evidence for that, I try to encompass, the whole human past in a sense, even the pre-human past in the sense of going back beyond the origins of Homo sapiens. And I also try to reconstruct from archaeological evidence and from analogies with evidence unearthed by or disclosed by anthropology. I try to reconstruct some of the very earliest human thinking. And I think, that in a sense, the ideas that are the most important in the history of the world are the oldest. Because they've been around for the greatest length of time. They've been influencing us for much longer than more recent ideas. And we shouldn't fall into the fallacy of thinking that our thinking or thinking of recent times is better than that of people hundreds, of thousands of years ago, or many scores of thousands of years ago, because the evidence is that they were cerebrally equipped with all the cognitive faculties that we have today. And actually, their brains were slightly bigger. I'm not sure that's relevant, but they certainly had all our cognitive equipment, and they were capable of thinking of anything. And I think that some of the ideas that they came up with are very impressive. I'm very fond of the idea of God. I think that wasn't the sort of childish and idiotic notion that a lot of rather belligerent atheists like Richard Dawkins take it for. It's an extremely subtle and complex notion, which, as far as we know, no other creature except humankind has managed to think of. So I think that's a great idea. But I think I might have told you before that my very favorite idea is the idea of nothing. Because in a way, I think that's the starting point of everything. It's such an incredible achievement of the human mind, as far as we know. This happened a very long time ago. To think of nothing, because it is literally unexampled in experience. And it's also, conceptually very elusive notion, because as soon as you think of it, it ceases to be nothing and becomes something. And in my way, I'll argue in the book that an awful lot of very positive thinking came from the appreciation of this essentially negative notion. And then obviously, you can mention more obvious things like language. I think I've already said that misunderstanding is very common, and it's the deficiencies of language that are mainly responsible for that. Nonetheless, despite its deficiencies, language is another fantastic resource that we've been able to use as humans. And this goes back, I mean, we don't know how far it goes back. I think it probably goes back far longer than the evidence. That it's at least 50,000 years, and I think very much older than that. So these are the really precious building blocks of the whole of the rest of the history of thought, and we should appreciate the geniuses, the unnamed geniuses amongst our very remote ancestors who had the brilliance first to formulate them.
Yeah, I always appreciate your thoughts on those and the sanctity of some of these foundational ideas. Is there any of those, either foundational ones and much more ancient or more modern even ones, that given the pace of technology or the current moment we're living in, the scope of change that seems to be kind of ever present, that would be useful ideas for us going forward in the future, either ones that have emerged going past, or do you think there's new ideas that need to emerge in order for us to be kind of living in a more successful world going forward, if we're looking from the past?
I certainly think you're right that change is the universal characteristic of everything that we know about. And one of the great achievements of our remote ancestors was to imagine changelessness, to imagine eternity, to imagine infinity, to imagine God, to imagine those universal realities which perhaps exist independently of their instantiations, and which exist in an ideal world that doesn't change. All of those were just fantastic triumphs of human imagination, just to think of such things, because they don't exist in experience. Our ancestors didn't think of them because they had experimental or sensory evidence about them. It was pure genius that led them to be able to conceive of them at all. And I suppose, therefore, that being able to understand change would be a great blessing for the world if it were possible. It's very, very difficult because we're enmeshed in change. We can't step outside it, sort of look at it objectively. But I did write a book about this as well, called A Foot in the River, which is a book about the history of how people have thought about change. And it just, it just has baffled all the best minds that have tried to explain, why don't we live in a more stable, if not totally stable, cosmos? Why is change so prevalent? Why does it appear to accelerate as time goes on? What would be the consequences of that in a future where the pace of change becomes unmanageable, intolerable? And all of these are problems that I think it behoves us at least to think about, because we are facing extinction. We're facing extinction not only from the threat of a changing environment, but also from unpredictable effects of technologies of our own creation, particularly genetics and robotics, both of which handled badly, literally could lead to the extinction of humankind. And considering how a short time we've been on this planet for compared with other species, and considering the changes that we've registered in our behavior, at least, if not in our physiology over the time we've been around, the danger that we're going to be a short-lived species must be very considerable. We really ought to be thinking about that, and thinking about, well, do we want to perpetuate our existence? Because the brutal truth is we haven't been very good for the planet that we've been on. Most other species, except the ones we eat, haven't benefited in the long run from the way we've treated them, the way we've handled them. We haven't even been very nice to each other on that. So our record isn't terribly good. Well, do we want to perpetuate that record? Do we want to survive in the future? Most people seem to assume that we should, or we do. And if you do want to survive in the future, how are we going to do it? Because, most of what we do isn't very conducive to our own long-term survival. And broadly speaking, evolution suggests that very complex organisms such as ourselves don't tend to be very long-lived. So in terms of species survival. So I guess those are the things that we ought to be bending our minds towards. Whether there's a specific idea that we ought to think more about, well, I think we should think more about humility, about our own vices and guilt, how we can improve on an individual level and then improve our own communities before we start being nasty about other people, including other people in the past. I think that's very important. And that's in a way, I suppose, why, because I teach or try to teach at the University of Notre Dame, and I am a Catholic, and one of the reasons why I'm a Catholic is that I find a religion that encourages me, to go to confession and even feel, shame at my own guilt. Actually, it does have the means of equipping me to make myself, at least to try and make myself better. And so, I think that probably the idea that's going to be most helpful to us is the idea of God, about thinking about, how we stand in relation to eternity and to infinity, and how we're going to, work in the world to bridge the gap that separates the reality we know from the reality that we can only imagine or grasp conceptually. And next month, I've got to give a lecture about G.K. Chesterton at Notre Dame's London Satellite. And as a result, I've really been sort of reading all the things by Chesterton that I've never read before. And this morning, I read a very little known story of his about a knight whom he calls Sir Laverock. And I guess the name is meant to suggest, the sort of French verb laver, so it's meant to suggest purity and cleanliness. And it's also meant to suggest truth, because, of course, ver also, is particle, which in many Romance languages is associated with words for truth. And it's also meant to suggest rock, So, it's meant to suggest, a strong foundation, for building something worthwhile. So this knight is obviously, kind of clearly represents a lot of goodness. But he's an outlaw, and he's a wild rebel, and a criminal. Nevertheless, he's got one virtue, which is that he always goes to church. Being that terrible guy, but at least one thing you can say to him, he doesn't behave like a Christian. At least he goes to church. Nevertheless, he becomes the hero of the story because he alone confronts this terrible monster that's destroying the world, and this monster is clearly, to 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 Chesterton, the sort of monster of capitalism and industrialization. And he conquers the monster, not by becoming a monk or a hermit and leaving the world and sort of just praying for it. He confronts the monster by entering the world, by dwelling in the monster's belly, like Jonah in the whale, and converting the monster from within. And I just think that's a great parable for how, however much we may feel that the world is a dangerous and destructive and hateful place, the best thing we can do is, to try to work from within it to make it better. And I find religious inspiration a great help in that connection. It's not necessary. Many wonderful people achieve far more than I ever could by working within the world without any religious presuppositions. But that's the task that I think one's got to face, because we'll only, if we do perpetuate the species, if we do in that sense save the world, it will only be by operating on it from within. The grace that we can pray for may get us to heaven. It won't perpetuate survival of the species on Earth.
Yeah, no, I think that there's so much truth in what you said, from the paradox of pondering reality in through infinity, and in through something that's larger and more transcendent than ourselves, that we pale in comparison, is inconceivable to us, can help us better understand the present moment and what we're living in, and the destructive patterns that we may be doing, and patterns within ourselves that we may need to change in order to better ourselves, and in turn that's really the only way to better the world.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. I'm very grateful to you for saying that I've said something that seems to you to be true. And I guess probably it would be unwise to continue the conversation to the point where you discover things that I say that are untrue. I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you and your viewers and listeners. Again, I wish you and them all happiness and success for the podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for your time. I'd love to be a fly on the wall at GK Chesterton. That sounds like a lovely course, and yeah, we can go ahead and stop it here.